This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas.
Okay, let's unpack this. I mean, we all think we know what having a baby means, right?
Less sleep, more diapers, a whole new schedule.
Exactly. But what if that change is, well, much deeper? What if becoming a parent fundamentally changes you? And I'm talking down to your actual gray matter, the basic chemistry flowing through your veins.
That is precisely what our sources are drilling down into today. Our whole mission here is to do a deep dive into that neurobiological transformation.
So we're looking at the hormonal, the structural, the functional shifts in the brain.
And how it all adapts to the massive demands of a newborn.
And the core tension here is just fascinating, especially when you compare mothers and fathers. For mothers, you have these massive physiological changes from pregnancy and labor.
Of course.
But for fathers, the transformation is thought to be driven almost entirely by experience, by active hands-on involvement. It's just this incredibly potent example of adult brain plasticity.
We'll be connecting those dots, between the behavior, the hours spent feeding or rocking a baby, and measurable shifts in hormones like oxytocin and testosterone.
And changes in brain networks like the amygdala.
Exactly. And maybe most surprisingly, the long-term protective impacts of all this on your cognitive health across your entire life. This deep dive is going to show you that parenting isn't just a role you take on. It's a profound developmental stage that literally remodels your mind.
Let's start with the endocrine system in new fathers, because this is where that link between behavior and biology is just so direct.
It is. Since men don't go through that prenatal hormone roller coaster, the sources suggest their brains adapt primarily through, the day-to-day active caregiving.
The hands-on stuff?
The hands-on stuff. And what's fascinating is how immediately the body begins to adjust, almost like it's reprioritizing its resources toward the child.
So how does that show up?
Well, studies show that fathers who are highly involved, and we're talking 3 hours or more a day in childcare, they tend to have significantly lower baseline levels of testosterone, or T.
Lower than fathers who are less involved.
Much lower, yes.
We've heard about that drop in T.
Right.
But why? What's the theory there? Is the body just reallocating energy away from other things?
That's exactly the prevailing theory. Testosterone is so often linked to mating effort and risk-taking behaviors.
Right.
So by lowering those basal T levels, the body might be physiologically shifting resources away from those behaviors and directly toward caregiving. It's literally a biological nudge towards nurturing.
And on the flip side of that, you have oxytocin, the famous bonding hormone.
Yeah.
Does that go up just as reliably?
It does. Oxytocin, or OT levels, tend to rise in fathers within the first 6 months. It really mirrors what we see in new mothers. And higher OT levels correlate directly with that stimulatory contact.
So things like nuzzling, tactile stimulation, just positive engagement.
All of that.
Okay, so T goes down to nurture, OT goes up to bond. But let's talk about cortisol, the stress hormone. Because for any new parent listening, the stress levels in those first few months are astronomical.
Cortisol, or CORT, is really complex here because it seems to act in 2 different phases for fathers.
Okay.
So initially, your basal CORT levels actually decline significantly right after a father holds his newborn for the first time.
A decline. So it's a calming effect.
A very quick physiological response that seems to facilitate that initial bonding.
That sounds like an instant reward loop.
Yeah.
But what about the constant exhaustion, the vigilance?
And that's the second phase. If you look ahead to 2 to 4 months postpartum, the sources show that higher basal CORT levels were actually associated with greater involvement in play and childcare.
Wait, hold on. Higher stress hormone is linked to more involvement. That seems totally counterintuitive.
It does, and it puzzled researchers at first. But it raises this critical question about parental vigilance.
So it's not just bad stress.
The interpretation is that this higher CORT level might represent the physiological arousal needed to meet the constant, unpredictable demands of a baby. You're always on call.
So that cortisol surge might be what drives you to keep checking, keep responding.
Effectively boosting your involvement, even though it's metabolically costly.
Yes. So the whole hormonal system is doing this incredibly delicate, stressful balancing act.
Precisely. It's balancing intense bonding, that's your OT and your initial T drop, with the high alert state you need for survival, which is that later court rise, and other studies confirm it. Administering OT to fathers, for instance, increased caregiving, but it also increased T levels and court responses in some contexts.
So they're all working together.
It's a complex, integrated control system for both bonding and just managing the chronic stress of it all.
Okay, so moving from the chemistry to the actual circuitry,
Okay.
let's talk about neuroplasticity, specifically with the amygdala.
Right.
This region is so central to the parental brain network. It handles emotional learning, threat detection,
Yeah.
all skills you suddenly need in spades when you're in charge of a tiny human.
And this brings us to a really key finding. It's about the difference between expecting a baby and actually caring for one. A study compared expectant fathers with new fathers, and they found no significant difference in the overall amygdala connectivity between the two groups.
So just anticipating fatherhood wasn't enough to remodel the brain. The change is purely about the lived experience.
Absolutely. The sources are really clear on this. The change is driven by experience, not just the impending status change. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Lay it on me.
In the new fathers, they found a very specific correlation. The more hours they spent in direct, hands-on childcare,
Okay.
the stronger the resting state functional connectivity was between their right amygdala and the regions involved in higher order cognition, mentalizing.
All right, for us non-neuroscientists, can you break that down? What are those connected regions, like the supramarginal gyrus? What do they do?
A fair question. You can think of the amygdala as your emotional alarm bell.
Right.
And these connected regions are like the brain's social interpretation software. They're heavily linked to empathy, to social cognition, and specifically to processing infant cues, telling a whimper from a serious cry.
So the amygdala is forging a faster, stronger connection to the part of the brain that figures out what the alarm is for.
Exactly. It's like installing a direct, high-speed fiber optic line between your emotional alarm and your social processing centers. It makes interpreting your baby's needs almost instantaneous.
And the more hours you put in, the sheer quantity of childcare, the tighter that connection became.
That is the precise takeaway. And here's a crucial nuance. That strong connection was linked to the quantity of childcare hours. It was not associated with measures of the quality of involvement.
But wait, quality doesn't matter as much as quantity. Does that mean just passively holding the baby for hours counts?
Well, the sources define it as direct childcare, which includes all those essential hands-on tasks, diaper changes, feeding, dressing.
The things that demand your full attention.
Right. The data suggests the sheer volume and intensity of that direct physical experience is what sculpts the brain. It's the repetition, the constant vigilance. That's what drives the change.
The brain is actively prioritizing an efficient response to the baby's signals. It's a marvelous adaptation.
It is. So if we accept that fathers are neurobiologically sculpted by this active experience, let's pivot to the mother's experience. She has both the physiology and the experience. And we can frame this using the term matrescence.
Matrescence. It was coined by an anthropologist, Dana Raphael, right?
That's right. And it describes the transition to motherhood as this major biosocial event. Critically, it's a neurocognitive developmental stage. It's not just a role change, it's a mind-body transformation.
And during this stage, mothers often report cognitive changes, the thing everyone colloquially calls baby brain.
Exactly. Subjectively, something like 80% of new mothers report a decline in memory or concentration.
But the sources suggest the objective reality is a little more nuanced than just feeling scattered.
It is. Meta-analyses do confirm subtle objective memory issues, but they're strongest during the third trimester of pregnancy. What's critical is that these objective deficits often disappear pretty quickly postpartum.
But mothers still report feeling forgetful for up to a year.
They do. So the question is, why do they feel that way if the objective tests say their memory is back to baseline?
And the answer is?
It seems to be directly tied to the massive, unparalleled increase in cognitive load. Think of your brain like a computer's RAM. You are suddenly running dozens of background apps at once, feeding times, temperature checks, nap schedules, anticipating needs, constantly evaluating risks.
So it's not a memory problem, it's a resource allocation problem.
Precisely. That overload, combined with chronic sleep deprivation, makes you feel scattered, even if your underlying memory hardware is working just fine.
That makes the comparison to adolescence even more powerful.
It does, because we also see profound structural changes. The maternal brain goes through significant neuroplasticity. This includes reductions in gray matter volume in places like the hippocampus during pregnancy.
Reductions. That sounds bad.
But it's not a deficit. It's thought to be pruning and optimization. The brain is getting rid of unused connections to make room for hyperspecialized circuits dedicated to mothering. And this process is very similar to what we see in adolescence.
In adolescence, I was just going to say that. It's a similar kind of rewiring.
It's exactly the same principle. Matrescence and adolescence are both these sensitive periods where the brain is primed to learn new, experience-dependent skills.
So if the short-term challenge is cognitive overload and reorganization, let's talk about the long game. The sources frame long-term parenthood as a form of environmental enrichment.
This is where we can connect to animal research. It shows that motherhood gives these neural and cognitive benefits, almost like living in an enriched cage for a rat. It enhances their learning and memory.
And for humans, we call that building cognitive reserve.
Exactly. Cognitive reserve is just the brain's resilience to damage or decline.
You build it up through complex jobs, learning a language, higher education.
Right. And the sources suggest that active parenthood provides the sustained, complex environment for 2 or more decades. All that problem-solving, emotional regulation, and logistical planning, it's comparable to a highly complex job.
So parenting for decades is like a cognitively demanding job that pays neuroprotective dividends later in life.
That's the argument. It leads to increased cognitive reserve. In fact, established measures like the Cognitive Reserve Index questionnaire already give higher scores to people with more children or caregiving duties.
So what does the hard data show for midlife outcomes? Does this only apply to the birth parent?
Crucially, no. It applies to both. Higher parity, which just means having more children, is associated with younger-looking white matter in middle-aged mothers. But it's also associated with enhanced cognitive performance like better visual memory and processing speed in midlife for both mothers and fathers.
That finding is profound. It really shows the benefits are driven by the complexity of the caregiving experience itself, not just gestation.
Absolutely. The sustained demand is the enrichment. However, there is an important nuance here. Okay, the optimal outcomes for cognitive performance and the lowest dementia risk. They often show a U-shaped association. This is seen in both men and women.
A U-shape implies a sweet spot. Where's the balance point?
The best cognitive outcomes are typically seen in parents with 2 to 3 children.
And the U-shape means that both childlessness and having, say, 5 or more children are associated with slightly worse outcomes.
That's right. Having what's called grand multi-parity 5 or more kids was linked to slightly worse cognitive outcomes later in life.
Why would that be? Why would the benefits start to erode?
Well, the sources suggest that at a certain point, the resource drain and chronic stress of raising a very large family, which often correlates with socioeconomic challenges, can start to outweigh the cognitive benefits.
So the quality of that enriched environment really matters. If the stress becomes too overwhelming, it starts to deplete your reserve instead of building it.
Exactly. The whole discussion comes back to that. The brain's adaptation to parenting is just a reflection of how it responds to continuous environmental demands, for better or for worse.
So to summarize this whole deep dive,
The sources really show, collectively, that for both mothers and fathers, the experience of active, hands-on caregiving drives this profound, measurable, and long-lasting neuroplasticity. It might be the most powerful example of the adult brain adapting to meet demands across the lifespan.
but that question of causality still remains, and the sources raise it themselves. Does a certain brain configuration predispose you to be a more involved parent? Or does the experience of parenting cause the change? We're still trying to untangle that loop.
We are. But what really stands out is the clear mandate, especially for fathers. Your intentional, measurable time investment in childcare is directly related to your brain's malleability. It's an incredibly clear signal from biology to get involved.
And here's the final provocative thought for you to take with you. If the complex, unending demands of active parenting really do function as a powerful form of environmental enrichment that protects your brain in late life, then you have to consider how the type of caregiving environment you create, how engaging, how responsive, how structured, will ultimately shape your own cognitive reserve over those decades. The nurturing, complex environment you build for your child might just be the best, most long-lasting investment you ever make for your own brain health. Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other podcasts, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.